welcome to another Britflicks.com podcast. My name's Stuart Wright, and today's guest is Tim McKenzie-Smith. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Stuart. How you doing?
We're here to talk about your debut feature, a documentary called Getting It Back, the Story of Cymande's. We're also going to cover 3 films that have impacted everything in your adult life. But before we get into that, let's talk about the documentary. And before I get into any details about the process of making it, just want to give the listener a brief synopsis to what the documentary is about.
Yeah, so it's called Getting It Back, the Story of Cymande's. It's about a long-lost British band from the 70s who played a mixture of funk, calypso, soul, and everything in between, who did 3 amazing albums in the 70s, but no one in the UK really gave a shit about them, quite honestly. But they found success in the States. They were the first British band to play the Apollo. They toured with Al Green, and they were playing to massive audiences, and their tunes were getting in the top 20 in the R&B charts, and they were really making a splash. But every time they came home, they could barely get a gig in a pub, and they got no support from any of the institutions of British life. And they decided to quit and to take a break because they were so sort of beaten down by the process. And they all went on to do very different, disparate jobs. 2 of them became lawyers, 1 became an electrician, and a few of them stayed in the music business. But while they were doing their own thing, the music went on a journey of its own. It was taken up in the very early days of hip hop and disco. Some of their tracks were like core documents in the history of the development of these 2 genres, these nascent genres. And they then became one of the most sampled British bands of all time, because the kids whose parents bought the records in the 70s in New York started raiding their parents' record collection for breaks. And they found these 3 albums with all sorts of amazing things on them, proper treasure trove of breaks and samples and all sorts of things. And the music just took on this amazing life of its own, and ultimately over a period of 40 years went through the generations, went through the genres, to the point where kids were picking it up on Spotify and YouTube, and the algorithm was telling them to listen to this band. And eventually the band realized this and realized that they had an audience out there that they had no idea existed. So they came back. They made their comeback in 2014, and I was there at the gig at Coco, which was a beautiful experience and quite interesting. I felt like I was one of the oldest people there, because all these kids were there. It was an amazing young audience, all appreciating this music. And I then thought, a few years later, that this was a story that should be out there, and I wanted to be the one to tell it.
I felt like it was my own little petri dish of how I found them, because I literally didn't know about them till your documentary. And what's weird about that is I had Electro 4, 5, and 6. My first gig I ever went to was the Bigger and Deffer tour, LL Cool J. So I was, in the 80s, I was into hip-hop and electro and stuff. And then even sort of house music. I mean, Stu Allen on Piccadilly Radio in Manchester, you had Beat This, which was like the hip-hop hour, and you had the house hour. I used to stay up till 12 o'clock, set my tape going at 12, and then go to sleep because it was a Sunday night show. So I could get 45 minutes of house music in sort of 87 or something. And I had this name never crossed my path at all. And it's weird then when you see a documentary and see all these people who I've listened to, who it was a key thing. And I mean, and there's a great quote in your film, which, I mean, you must have been over the moon when I think it's Vincent Mason says, if it hadn't been for songs like what Cymande's were doing, there'd be no hip hop. I mean, that's phenomenal for a band that were largely were unnoticed until, like you said, like the way that the internet spreads music, that it began to sort of pick up its own infamy, I suppose, as this foundation of 2 big columns of dance music.
Yeah, I mean, it was really interesting for me as coming to it as a fan. I knew this. What were kind of interested me were the questions of, initially, for me, it was, well, where did they go, and why don't more people know them? Because, as a fan of the music, I picked it up on a mixtape in the 90s, and it was a mixtape where I didn't have a track list on there. It was just going around my uni. It's just called Rare Groove, and everyone was copying it and passing it on, And there were 2 Cymande tracks on there, which I didn't know was Cymande at the time, and they were 2 of my favorite tracks on the album. But I just thought they were an American funk band, you know, at the time, because they were 2 of their more kind of funky tunes. And so I then found out about 5 years later who they actually were, because I had a really good mate of mine who was a record collector, and he had their records, and he was playing me Cymande and telling me about this band. They're from South London. We were living in Streatham at the time, and then I heard these tunes that I've been listening to for years and who they were by, and I was like, oh my God, it's them, you know. And that kind of set me down a path of kind of always having in my mind, well, more people should know about this. Why don't more people know about the fact that we've got this amazing British funk band that you know, as I then learned more, I realized just how deep the sampling went and started to understand more of the story. You know, and so it was always, that was the question for me, was, you know, what happened to them? Yeah, it was only in the making of the film where I got to really understand the all the other elements that were in play, just how influential they were, and just the kind of sheer depth of people like me that were out there, you know, because also you go into the process and you're not necessarily sure who within those genres is going to be willing to talk to you, how enthusiastic they're really going to be. You're projecting and hoping that they're going to be as enthusiastic about them as you are, but you don't really know until you're in a room with them. I mean, you know, you get an inkling, because I came from sport documentaries, really, sort of before doing this one. A lot of the time when you're doing interviews for sport documentaries, the people that you're interviewing, it feels like, you know, they're doing it with a gun to their head, because they don't want to be, they're just trotting out stuff that they've said a million times. Or they don't want to be talking about this subject. They're not interested in it, but you're paying them. You know what I mean? Whereas this, it was proper enthusiasm in the room, and it was 2 people who were fans of something, basically fanboying about it for an hour. So it was wonderful in that regard, you know. And the way I conducted the interviews was quite loose and relaxed, because I wanted to be very present and be really listening. Do you know what I mean? Because I didn't know what they were going to say. You know, there were certain beats you always want to hit in an interview for a documentary, but ultimately the key is that you're listening, and if they're going in directions that you didn't know existed, you have to be present enough to jump on that and then go down that road and explore it, you know. And that's where the kind of magic comes, I think, you know. So the interviews we got with some incredible names, it was a pretty joyous thing for me, just as a fanboy of not only Cymande but mainly these people as well that I was interviewing. You know, like Maceo from De La Soul. I mean, come on, like Norman J. I mean, ridiculous. Norman J. probably had more influence on my musical knowledge than any other human. You know, and I'm sat in a room in Brixton, the Prince of Wales, just chatting to him about music for an hour. I mean, it doesn't get much better than that, you know.
Exactly. Now, given you've said it was like there was a journey of discovery making the film. I mean, often when I speak to people who have done documentaries, there's a perception of what I'm going to do, and then there's the change of perception through doing a documentary. So I'm guessing by the sounds of things, you had a lot of those moments as your understanding of their importance began to evolve. So what for you is like your fondest sort of discovery about Cymande that is in the film, then for you sort of justified why you were on this journey to make the film?
Well, I mean, there's so many, really, but I mean, the most important discovery, I think, in terms of how the film turned out and the importance to me of the story that is wider than just the music was really the understanding that I got from the band just about what life was like for them growing up in the UK. And, you know, them as representatives of the Black community in the UK, you know, in the 50s, 60s and 70s, and all the obstacles that they faced. You know, I was slightly concerned about projecting something like that from my position as someone who hadn't lived that experience, you know. And I was writing a treatment for it, because in the early days of doing this work, I thought maybe I might be able to get someone to fund it. I thought, well, I'm going to write a treatment and do a trailer and stuff. So I was writing this treatment. And when I got to this certain point of the context and the realities of the Black experience in the UK, I felt like I couldn't write the words because I hadn't done any interviews with the guys yet. And I just felt like there's something holding me back because I didn't feel it was my place to write this yet. No. And it's almost like I needed, permission is probably the wrong word, but I needed sort of them to unlock the door and let me walk through it, if you see what I mean.
Well, I guess that they give you the authority, because I know what you mean, because in a treatment, you've got to sell what the potential drama is of the documentary you're going to make.
Yeah.
But predicting that in a treatment feels a bit
exactly
too presumptuous. Whereas if you're talking to them about it, it gives you an authority, doesn't it?
So I basically emailed Stephen Patrick, the two founder members of the band, and just kind of said, look, you know, it'd be really great if you could give me some background on the reality of your experiences growing up and as a band, you know, and the obstacles that were put in your way by the institutions of British life. The institutions of British life.
Yeah.
And they sent me this incredible document. It was, you know, a Word document. It was probably sort of 7-8 pages long. And it laid everything out, and it became kind of like the blueprint for us to go down those avenues in terms of the context and the historical side of it, which is really important to me, because it is an important story of life in Britain at the time and the experience of young Black people and the obstacles that they faced.
Yeah.
So once I had that, I felt like I'd almost I gave myself permission to go down those avenues without any kind of concerns in that regard, you know. So that was a really important moment, getting that from the guys. And then on the other side with the music, it was the sheer joy of getting to film it, you know. Firstly, filming with the band, and then once we captured things on camera, we just knew that we had some potential magic here. And then it was a case of, well, you know, if this film isn't good, then the only person whose fault it is mine.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? The raw materials are definitely there. Now it's up to me to make sure I don't mess it up.
I mean, you're right. There's a sort of the Black experience of America between just across a decade moved so much, because I guess early 70s and what you show with some of your archive footage is there's still a kind, well, I mean, not that it's gone completely, but there's a strong know your place and we can just get rid of you when we don't want you anymore, as opposed to this is your home, welcome, and be part of what Britain is, you know. Whereas you move forward to the end of the 70s and you've got, and again, these are not massive leagues, but they would have been, I suppose, in comparison to the early 70s, Laurie Cunningham playing for England at football, you know, the first Black footballer to put the England shirt on, you know, but that was 6 or 7 years after the first album come out. So it's a timely reminder in some senses as to how unwelcoming and how violent, grim it was, the level of, you know, outward racism.
And music and the institutions of British culture were just representative of life in general across the spectrum, you know. There's a sequence that due to time and everything, we were gutted that we had to cut out of the film, which is Stephen Patrick and Sam talking about their experiences at school. You know, it was a miserable experience as a young Black kid who come over from the Caribbean to go to a British school, you know, for myriad reasons. And, you know, so music and the institutions of cultural life that ignored the band were just indicative of the country as a whole. You know, people who came from the Caribbean were invited over as British citizens. You know,
British passports.
They had British passports, exactly. And then when they got here, the way they were treated was ridiculous and horrible, and they had to, you know, really rally around in the community in order to survive in many ways. So it's a really important part of the story, you know, for me, you know, and it makes it more, I think, than I hope anyway, more than just a standard music documentary, because, you know, a lot of music documentaries and sport documentaries and any documentaries that have a kind of historical bent, you know, they always have sort of pay lip service to the context. You know, if there's a documentary about a band in the 80s, you're always going to see shots of the miners' strikes and Thatcher and all of that. If it's in the 90s, you're going to see Blair, Diana, all that kind of stuff. But it's only just to kind of go, this was the era, this was what was going on at the time. But it doesn't really play into the actual story. Whereas this, it was an important part of why the band split, ultimately, because they weren't given the support that they really deserved. Like when they would tour in America and playing, stadiums, 30,000 people, touring without Green, playing the Apollo, if they were any other band, like a white band, they would have, as soon as they got back, they would have got an old grey whistle test.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, why were they not on old grey whistle test when they just toured the States and they're in the top 20? Like, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. So, yeah, the context had played a huge role, and learning that was an important part of the journey for me, for sure.
Yeah, and to sort of complete that arc, the idea that then, I think it's late 80s Ruthless Rap Assassin, isn't it? When they do their rap using Cymande's music to tell a story of the Windrush.
Yeah, exactly. They were the next generation. They were talking, and they were talking about their parents. They were talking about the sadnesses in the lives of their parents and how things had panned out over here. And so they were carrying the story on. From a slightly different perspective as kids who were born in the UK. Cymande, the guys in Cymande weren't born in the UK. They all came over at varying ages as kids.
Yeah.
So they can remember what life was like before they came over here, before they came into the smog and the freezing weather and the general greyness of 50s and 60s Britain. They can remember what life was like in the Caribbean. So whereas the Ruthless Rap Assassins, they were born and raised here, but the problem still remained.
Yeah.
Again, when we interviewed those guys in Manchester, and there's an extended version of that chapter in the Blu-ray that we're releasing. They talked about their experiences in a similar vein. The racism that they endured and the problems that they faced. Also, them as a band, there's a similar thing there. They were very ahead of their time, weren't supported in the way they should have been, because they were turning out some brilliant British rap music, but no one was interested. So yeah, the story continued basically.
So when you've got such a big story to tell, which literally straddles from when you literally straddle from when they arrive in Britain to when they're reforming and playing these gigs in the present day, what for you represented the main storytelling challenges, pulling that together into a 90-minute movie?
It's just balance, like trying to balance everything when you've got so many different story strands. How far do you go with one at the expense of another? And you've got 6 core characters that you want to make sure that people understand who they are and what they've done. You've got all the different musical elements, all the different genres, and the different generations of people who kept the story going, and obviously the context. So it was all about trying to balance those elements, and also you're trying to appeal to not only to people who know them, but also to people who don't know them. So you had to balance that out and not get too deep into the kind of nerdiness of it that might appeal to me, but also appeal to people who don't know them. You don't want to alienate half your audience. It's so balance is the key word. Just trying to balancing all those elements to try and create a narrative that works, but also is not favouring one group of people over another.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess I would fit into that audience, in that half of the audience that didn't know about them, because it definitely felt like, to me, you sort of gave us the real context as to what gave us the band in the first place. And then I love the way that you kept almost like there was like this parallel timeline, the way you're telling it, which is the band's music becoming big in America and then slowly becoming part of dance music culture over there, while at the same time they knew they couldn't go on. But then I felt like I didn't know what it was building to, because obviously I've not seen it before, but I felt we were building to some crescendo, and I was so glad that it was, and they picked their tools back up again and they are playing live to audiences that are more than half their age now.
Yeah, I mean, we always knew that you know, it's almost like the music becomes the protagonist in the second act, you know. But also you have to make sure that you're not just sidelining the band for half an hour. You've got to make sure that you're seeing what they're doing, and it's like these two stories are running in parallel. You've got the music story taking on a life of its own, and you've got the band members' stories of what they were doing at that time, and then it comes together as the music and the characters connect again, you know, and then it becomes one story again. And it was yeah, that was something that was really important to us. We felt we needed to separate the music and the band for that kind of era where the guys are in the wilderness, you know, and to the point where we had to do something that pained us massively in the edit, because when I the first shoot I did with the band, I got the guys in this rehearsal room in Acton to break down Bra for me, which is my favorite song ever, and has the famous bass break that is so widely sampled by, you know, hundreds of people over the years. And I got them just to kind of break it down for me and explain it and talk it and do it. And I was like, my God, this is so amazing. I can't wait for this. This is going to be one of the best bits in the film. But the problem was that Bra was the centerpiece of a huge sequence that was happening where the band weren't there. And this wasn't the kind of film where you're deeply analyzing the way the music was made, you know, like kind of classic albums or something like that. You know, Bra is a story point, you know, because it's the song that represents the birth of the Renaissance in New York. So we cut that sequence where you got loads of DJs playing it and talking about it, you know, around the birth of hip hop. And we were trying to incorporate this brilliant sequence of the guys doing stuff with it in the rehearsal room, but it wasn't working, because we just knew that we just needed them to be separate, because narratively, you know, the audience need to understand that the band and the music are two different things now.
Yeah.
You know, so let's take it out. And we were absolutely gutted to take it out, but we knew we had to, you know, it had to be done.
So what's happening with the Blu-ray then, and what have you managed to pack that with on top of the film? So
the Blu-ray's out on the 26th of February.
Okay.
And it's got some brilliant extras in it. It's got that sequence.
I was hoping you were going to say.
Yeah. It's so that was the key thing. Like when they said, so what else are you going to put on it? That was number one. It's also got an extended version of Jazzy J, legendary Zulu Nation DJ and all-round awesome dude, basically in his basement doing a Cymande mix, which he did for me on a Sunday in Brooklyn. And I'll tell you the story of this. It was the weirdest thing. So we did a shoot with him on the Friday, and Stephen Patrick went to meet him, and he was it blew his mind so much. He couldn't believe that they were in his house, to the point where the Saturday he came into our hotel because he was really annoyed that he forgot to get the guys to sign his records. So he brought his records in for the guys to sign on the Saturday. And then on the Sunday, I had a day off. So my cameraman, David Caulfield, the DOP, he said to me, look, you have a day off, relax, go and meet your mate. I had a mate who lived in Brooklyn, also called Dave. I'm going to just go around getting like detailed shots around New York. I don't need you for that. You know, you just go and chill. So I was on basically a bar crawl in Brooklyn, and my phone goes and it's Jazzy J, and he's like going, Tim, you got to come to the house, man. I'm like, why? What's going on? He goes, I was up all night and I've come up with a Cymande mix. You've got to come and film it. And I was like, damn straight, I've got to come and film it. But I was half cut at the time. And I was like, so I called my cameraman Dave up and I was like, mate, we've got to go back to Jazzy J's house. Where are you? He goes, oh, I'm up in Harlem. I said, right, get down to Brooklyn now. So we went to Brooklyn, back to Jazzy J's house. And I was just sat there on the sofa, having had a fair few beers on my day off, just kind of sitting there wide-eyed going, I can't believe this is happening. I'm in Jazzy J's basement and he's doing a Cymande mix. So that was one of the great moments of the experience of making the film. And there's an extended version of that in the extras. There's also, as I said, the Ruthless Rap Assassins extended feature, which goes into loads more detail about their experiences up in the UK. which is great. And again, it had to be cut for time, just because ultimately it's not about them. Film. It's a story that's worth telling and worth listening to.
No, I interviewed the guys behind the Scala documentary, and they had similar challenges, to keep it into sort of a 90-minute format when you've got so many stories to tell around.
It's hard, it's hard. Like, the first cut's always pretty unwieldy. And the funny thing with the first cut is that you've been spending 6 months on it, and you're kind of trying to kid yourself that, it'd be fine if it's 150, won't it? No, it'd be fine. It's just got so much in it. I couldn't lose any of it, And then you send it out to people who you respect, and just to kind of get an objective viewpoint on it. And you say to them, just don't tell me what you like about it. Tell me what you don't like about it. Tell me what's wrong with it. And, they're always like, too long, it's too long, it's too long, it's too long. And so you kind of know that, yes, it is too long, and I am being too beholden to things that I know in my soul need to go, but I'm just clinging on to them just a little bit too long because I love them so much, But the Blu-ray extra element has been a joy for that, because it's given us the opportunity to, keep these bits in a different way.
Brilliant. Well, look, Getting It Back, the story of Cymande, is going to be available on Blu-ray from the 26th of February. It is fantastic, and I think, like we've discussed, it balances beautifully the idea of this incendiary music as part of a bigger music scene of hip-hop and disco, and also one of the arguably kind of the best-kept secrets of British music you've revealed, and also a horrendous story of a reminder of institutional racism that may be the reason why they are a secret up until recently, in a sense. So congratulations on bringing all that to light.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
I should ask, was there anything else did we cover everything is there anything obvious that you didn't say or cover that you'd like to cover before we go into the 3 films?
I mean, the only thing that we haven't covered in terms of the making of it is just how fucking hard it is to make a fucking documentary. Like, over 6 years, when people are telling you, no, it's a bit niche, I'm not sure, and you're going, no, there is a story here we believe it needs to be told. And you have to just go through the fire to make it, when everyone's telling you, don't be so stupid. But that's the only area we didn't cover.
Well then, moving swiftly into 3 films that have impacted everything in your adult life. And for the listener that's come along to hear you talk about your film, I'll just briefly go over the sort of basic rules, and they're simple. You've given me 3 movies, and I'm going to give you 5 minutes to talk about what that lasting memory is of those movies. It's against the clock. So every time we hear this noise, you can hear that at your end, okay?
Yeah.
Every time we hear that noise, that's the time for us to stop talking about that film and move on to the next one. That sound fair enough?
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. Right, clock's ticking. And the first of your choices is Muhammad Ali, When We Were Kings, Leon Gast's documentary from 1996. Do you want to talk about where that fits in your film life?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably quite an obvious thing for a documentary maker to do, because it was like the origin story for a lot of people, I think, my generation anyway, to understand just what a documentary or cinema documentary could be. I watched it in Brisbane while I was traveling in 1997, and we watched it because I was thinking about Muhammad Ali, brilliant, we've got nothing on this afternoon, and I was with my mate Chappers, who I was traveling with, and we just didn't have massive expectations. We just thought it'd probably be quite a good watch, and came out just going, that's one of the greatest things I've ever seen. And I suddenly had an appreciation of what documentary could be. It appealed to everything that I loved. I was a huge boxing fan back in the 80s. I obviously wasn't old enough to have seen Muhammad Ali and George Foreman fight, but I obviously saw all of everyone knew Muhammad Ali at that point. He was, an icon, and it just blew my mind. And the fact that there was also this incredible gig there that James Brown was playing, and loads of other brilliant artists, like I think B.B. King and people like that. And the heavyweight talking heads they had were just ridiculous. It was like Norman Mailer and Spike Lee and people like this, and you were just like, this is like unbelievable cultural moment. And, it was footage that was kind of in boxes for 20 odd years.
Yeah.
And so you felt like you were witnessing something new, even though it was old. It wasn't just a documentary that, a lot of documentaries, the holy grail of all documentaries is archive that people haven't seen.
Yeah.
And this was a problem for our documentary because there was no archive of the band. This leads me to just go on one quick tangent, because I have to, because it's a great little story of the only bit of archive of Cymande. So we're talking about the complete opposite of When We Were Kings. There was no big box of tapes of Cymande. When I started the documentary, I was hoping there was going to be some footage of the band, but no, there wasn't, which is a bit of a struggle when you're doing a documentary, I'll tell you. But there was one bit of footage, and the band thought it was for German TV, right?
Mm-hmm.
They had a tape. It was the early iteration of a VHS. It wasn't the VHS that we knew and loved in the 80s, but it was the very early iteration of that.
Right.
So they filmed it in a club in London, and they thought it was going on German TV. But I had to find out who owned it to clear it, because I've used their tape.
Mm-hmm.
We had an archive producer who went all over Germany asking people about it, and everyone in Germany was like, "What the hell are you talking about? This is nothing to do with us." So I then went on the most ridiculous detective dig, where I found out that the production company that made it, who later became one of the early sort of home ordering VHS kind of horror movie people, they're called Intervision.
Oh, yeah.
They made this because I ascertained that basically what they did was that they filmed people in clubs for the clubs. So they create a TV show, a fake TV show essentially, that they would license the show and give the equipment to the club so that they could get around licensing laws, so they could claim it as live entertainment and stay open later.
Oh, wow.
But my lawyer was I was like, look, this company folded in like 1981. And my lawyer was like, yeah, but you still need to get someone's permission. And I was like, well, I can't find any evidence that any of them still exist. We're talking 50 years ago. So I went on this insane detective spree or something. I don't know what you want to call it, but trying to find someone who was still alive from Intervision to give us permission to use it. And I tracked down the only person I could track down is now a fly fishing tackle salesman in Tasmania. Took me a week to find him, and he was like, "Oh yeah, that was us. Yeah, sure, yeah, that's fine." And it was such a relief to get the permission. But yeah, bizarre. So I ended up learning about people in the early days of video nasties and the culture of getting around licensing laws in order to stay open later.
Perfect timing. I have to ask, I mean, just one question I wanted to ask you was, is there any direct influence of When We Were Kings in Cymande that you're conscious you made as a decision?
No, I don't think. It's funny. When we were making the film, I barely watched any documentaries for the last 6-7 years, because we didn't want to feel like we were ripping anything off. We just wanted to try and tell the story the right way as we saw it,
Right.
Obviously, a lot of people compare it in some ways to Searching for Sugar Man in terms of the kind of story of an artist who was long since forgotten, who came back, Yeah. And I watched Searching for Sugar Man when it came out and absolutely loved it. But Matt, my producer and editing partner, he had never seen it. And people kept saying to him, "Oh, you should watch Searching for Sugar Man." And he was like, "I am not watching for Searching for Sugar Man until we're finished, because I do not want to feel, even if it's subconscious, that in some way it's influenced my thinking as an editor." So no, When We Were Kings, I can't think of any specific influences. Like, you just got to try and tell the story as best you can.
Yeah.
You've got to serve that particular story, and if you try and sort of think, well, someone else did it that way, so we should do that, it's just you're then kind of thinking along the wrong lines, I think.
Got you. Right then, film number 2 is Get Shorty from 1995, directed by the Coen brothers, cinematographer of their first 3 films, Barry Sonnenfeld,
right,
and adapted for film by Scott Frank.
This is not the most obvious one, but I did love it when it came out. It's a really funny, offbeat tale of kind of a lone shark who moves to Hollywood and gets involved in the movie industry. Great satire, like great piece of satire immediately there. Thinking of a lone shark moving to Hollywood and immediately thinking, oh man, I should work in the movie business because there's so many sharks in there already. And an amazing cast. John Travolta basking in the afterglow of his Pulp Fiction rebirth.
Yeah.
You got Gene Hackman there, Dennis Farina, is one of my favorite ever character actors, who also is in probably what is my favorite ever film, Midnight Run. Absolutely adore that film and watch that film probably more than any other. But the reason I bring this one up is not because of the merits of the film. It's because I picked the book up while I was traveling. Again, I always seem to end up going back to when I'm traveling. It's a really formative, important part of my life. When I was in Australia in a bookshop in Byron Bay, and I picked the book up and I was like, I'm not sure I even realized that this was based on a book.
Okay.
And so I picked the book up. It was by Elmore Leonard, who I read the book, and the book was absolutely brilliant. And the dialogue that he wrote was just absolutely awesome. And I just suddenly had to just hoover up all of his books. I became a bit of an Elmore Leonard obsessive. And when I was a couple of years later, I was trying to work out what I wanted to do with my life. I knew I wanted to do something creative, and so I took a punt on a postgraduate course just called Writing and Production for the Media. And one of the modules on there was copywriting. And one of the assignments we had was to write a blurb for a book. And so I decided to choose Get Shorty just because it was a book I loved. And part of it was like, you've got to try and write in the voice of the author, And I thought that might be quite fun to try and write in the voice of Elmore Leonard, kind of hard-boiled, but with a twist of humor, So I did it. And the tutor said, "Oh, this is really good. My mate works at Penguin. I'm going to send it to her, see what she thinks." And I was like, "All right, okay, cool." And then she came back and said, "This is really good. By the way, Elmore Leonard's doing a sequel to Get Shorty right now, which we're about to publish. Do you want to have a stab at doing the blurb for it? The cover copy, as it was called." I was like, "Oh yeah, why not? That'd be great, So I did it, and they used it, and so my blurb was on the back of the sequel. Be cool,
fantastic.
And then I spent the next probably 6 months, because they were reissuing all of his books. Spent the 6 months just knocking out blurbs for about 10, 15 Elmore Leonard books. Getting the books, reading them in I've read half of them already, so reading them in half a day to a day, and then knocking a blurb out, getting paid 53 quid. To do it. Yeah. But it was brilliant, and what it taught me, and the way it relates to what I'm doing now, it taught me that I could edit.
Yeah,
because essentially you're boiling a book down into probably 65 words, and also in these particular ones, you had to get a pull quote out, the kind of key quote that sums the book up, and that was something I felt I could do, and that's what I've ended up doing, because essentially editing words and editing pictures is the same thing.
Great.
Writing is editing is writing. It's all the same thing. Ultimately, you're trying to boil something down to its essence and tell the story in whatever format you're doing it, whether it's in 60 words or 90-minute film or a 90-page script, whatever. Essentially, the question is always, well, what's the story? What's the story I'm telling here? Don't veer from the story. What is it that you're trying to say? So it kind of gave gave me kind of the confidence to kind of go, do you know what? I probably can do something in this field, so let's give it a try.
No, I totally agree. I mean, it's pulling together pitch decks and creating log lines for films and film ideas is about economy, not about prose.
100%. And like doing the film, what people say is, we need What's that?
Say, finish your thought. The alarm was just going off then. Finish your thought.
Oh, the bell's gone. Oh, sorry. No, like, they say, can we have a synopsis? Can we have a log line? All of this stuff, and so bringing those tools to bear, it's the same thing. You're trying to sell something in as few words as possible. I'm basically repeating what you just said, but in a lamer way.
but I think but just for people listening who are not too aware, it's a process that takes time, though. It might only be 60 words, but you can take a day sometimes.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. It's easy. It's like editing a film takes a year.
Yeah.
And it always ends up getting to the point where you think, well, it should always just have been like this. Of course it's going to end up like this. But the avenues of pain and horror that you get to that point that seems so simple and seems so obvious afterwards, is ridiculous. And it's the same with writing. You smashing your head against the wall until suddenly it's what it always should have been, and you're like, well, why can't I just do that first? Why have I got to go through all of these drafts and all these versions to get to the point that's really obvious that this needed to get to?
Well, just referring to Scott Frank, who wrote the film Get Shorty. I mean, even though he's such a celebrated screenwriter, he still fears the blank page because he knows he has to go through that process. But you don't know when you start whether you'll get to the other end, because you've got
to put one foot in front of the other and just do it, And it's the same with editing a film, especially a documentary where you've shot hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of footage with multiple people on multiple subjects that you could go in 8,000 different directions with it. But when you first start, and you've just got all these rushes and you're like, okay, where first then?
God,
but you just got to believe in the process. You've got to start going through the material, log it, start putting it into bins where you're just working out, well, this would work in this theme. This is a good character bit here, and you just got to break it down into stuff that's manageable, because if you start projecting too far forward, you go mad. It's like, okay, what do I do today to push it forward that's not going to break my brain?
Absolutely. Right then, sir, your final choice rushes us forward into the 21st century to 2006. Directed by Martin Scorsese. I'm talking about The Departed, the reworking of Alan Mack and Felix Chong's Hong Kong action thriller Infernal Affairs. Not an obvious Scorsese choice, but tell us where it fits in with you.
Okay, so it's not an obvious Scorsese choice. You're right. It's not the greatest Scorsese film. I still love it. It's got some great things.
I love it too.
Going with. It's a great adaptation of Infernal Affairs. Despite the fact that Matt, my editor, has refused to watch it because he thinks it's a disgrace that anyone would adapt to Infernal Affairs, one of the greatest films ever in his opinion. So he just refuses to watch it. But the reason I do it is twofold, really. One, Scorsese was the guy that kind of opened my eyes to many elements of cinema. I became obsessed with him in the early 90s. Probably it was because of Goodfellas, but I then went back and watched Mean Streets and Taxi Driver and The King of Comedy and The Colour of Money, which I suspect I'd already seen and loved, but didn't really know it was him, because he was kind of working as a gun for hire on that. But I did my dissertation on Scorsese. I was just obsessed with the guy, and he was my first cinematic love. But the reason I tell it is because the other love of my life, who I'm still with, Sarah, I met her traveling, again, going back to traveling in 97, but we were mates. We didn't get together until 2006, when she moved back from Australia, and I kind of knew that it was on the cards and it was going to happen, but I was terrified of messing it up because we were really good friends. And so even though she knew too, and she was, just patiently waiting for me to stop being an idiot. But I was terrified of messing up something that she was one of my best mates, and I didn't want to fuck it up, basically.
Yeah.
But we went to see The Departed, and it's not the most obvious date movie, but
not
we
at
went
all,
to see
no.
And for some reason, I don't know whether it was the intoxicating effects of Jack Nicholson being crazy, or Ray Winston's strange Boston accent, or you know, the Scorsese's 12th use of "Gimme Shelter." But that, for some reason, for some magical reason, that was the night that we did get together.
Fantastic.
So, you know, the combination of my cinematic love and my true love. There you go.
Fantastic. So when you wrote a dissertation about Martin Scorsese, what did you focus on?
It was the outsider, the protagonist, you know, the outsider in his films, because obviously he was a real outsider for most of his life because he had asthma, so he couldn't. In his early days, you know, the reason he got into go into movies was because he couldn't play sports, he couldn't do anything physical because he had such bad asthma.
Right.
And so I kind of felt like that was part of him always, and he always seemed to make choices where the main character was an outsider in some degree.
Yeah,
you know. The obvious ones is the ultimate outsider, Travis Bickle, but Rupert Pupkin in The King of Comedy as well. You know, the true outsider who is determined to show that he's worth something when he probably isn't. You know, but it always felt to me that Henry Hill as well in Goodfellas, even though he's part of it, even though he's part of the crew, as a half Irish guy, he's never going to truly be part of it. He's always going to be on the outside looking a little bit. He's never going to be a made guy. So that was what I was kind of going for. Well, I must admit I haven't read it for 20 years, and I'm sure it's absolute rubbish.
I had the French director on, J.K. Amelou, who did a film called Hard Men in '96, which kind of predates sort of Lock, Stock. It was like one of the first sort of British gangster movies that sort of broke out, and he told me, you know, he was like, whenever he got in a black cab, you know, they want to talk about it, and he managed to get some work developing some stuff or working with Scorsese, and he gets to Scorsese's place, and there's a stack of screenplays like just on a table, and JK said, I jokingly just said, you know, you're behind with your reading, and he goes, no, he says, they're all the projects I want to do that nobody will fund, kind of thing.
Yeah, wow.
And you think Scorsese's got that problem? Jeez, what the...
Yeah, I mean, thing is, you know, it's really interesting. His career is so interesting in that regard because, you know, he doesn't make choices that are necessarily going to be big money spinners, you know. And he went through the wilderness years in the 80s where people weren't going to see his films, and you know, he felt like, you know, there was a chance that his career might be over, you know, and he did do, you know, Color of Money. He did that as a gun for hire and did it so brilliantly, you know, that I think people I think that's probably one of the only ones where he's kind of done it just almost not coming from him. It came from somewhere else. And he said, yeah, I'll do that, you know. So he went through the wilderness, and he, even now, you know, as someone who's got probably the greatest career in American cinema, the fact that, you know, he's got projects that people won't commit to, it's incredible. You know, if I was someone with a lot of money at a studio, if he comes to me with anything, I'm commissioning it immediately.
Yeah.
You know, but it's a business, isn't it, ultimately?
Of course, yeah.
He has now got to the point where, you know, with the vagaries of streaming, you know, and the money that Netflix and Apple have, they obviously have seen the value to them of having someone like him on their, being associated with their brand. So he's managed to get loads of money out of them to do films that really, you know, are quite thematically dense and powerful and not obvious cinema fillers, you know.
Absolutely, yeah.
So but they're going, well, we'll give it a little cinema run, and then it's going to be on our platform, and then we're associated with Martin Scorsese. So in a weird way, even especially as like the foremost exponent of cinema as an art form and watching movies as an important part of life, it's quite interesting that they kind of jumped on the Scorsese bandwagon, you know, for completely different reasons. But ultimately, the kind of battle you have is that, well, yeah, these films wouldn't be made if they didn't. Killers of the Flower Moon would not be made if Apple hadn't come in and given him 200 million quid to do it, you know?
Absolutely.
So you can kind of go, well, it's that classic, the battle between art and commerce in making films is just one that, you know, everyone's affected by, even him, you know.
Indeed. Well, look, thank you for sharing those stories with the 3 films that have impacted everything in your adult life, and thank you for sharing the stories around getting it back, the story of Cymande.
No worries.
That's okay. Well, we'll remind people that's out on Blu-ray from the 26th of February. I'd totally recommend it. I can't wait to see some of those extras. And it just gives me to say thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Thanks, mate. No, I really enjoyed it.